I've just made two videos that will help you hopefully revise for the personality study for modern history, so Alexandra Kollontai. And the two videos simply just address the two sections of the exam, so Part A, Part B, which has been the basic and common structure for the last decade or even more actually. So it's fairly safe to assume that a structure similar to that will be in the upcoming exam, although that's not necessarily a rule as I understand it. But I've structured this in that way, so Part A and Part B. So let's just jump straight into Part A in this one. So I've got this sample question. Remember that Part A is generally a descriptive narration, so it's not necessarily an analytical question that you'll be asked to address in Part A. It's usually fairly straightforward, so not so much higher order thinking. It's more about factual information and about knowing your content. So this example is describe the family background and early life of the personality you've studied. It's generally worth 10 marks, so of 25, remember, so that's about 40% of the marks available here. So roughly you should be thinking about spending about 17-18 minutes on this, because you've got about 45 minutes for the entire personality study section of the exam. So what you're looking to do here really is try and provide some breadth to the answer. So you want to be describing the family background and early life in fairly broad terms. Okay, so you don't want to just get stuck with a discussion of her background or some very isolated features of her early life. You want to be able to discuss her early life up to maybe the time she was married or something like that. There's no clear rule on what early life means, but I think if you went beyond her marriage, it might be getting too late into her life to be considered relevant. So you want to cover that period in breadth, but you also want to cover that period in depth. So you want to have some deep factual information that you can use here. Remember, it's not analytical, it's more about having lots of facts and ideas that you can fill out your answer with to show that you understand the nuances of those issues, her family background and early life. So here you might think about structuring your notes or your planning even in your head, so brainstorming something in terms of three general themes. Now again, this is not a rule. I'm not suggesting that if you do three themes every time you'll get 10 out of 10. It's simply maybe an easy way to think about making sure you're covering that breadth. So the themes might be something like her early years, okay, so covering the family background, her education. So thinking about this as maybe education and middle years perhaps could be a good way to expand that a little bit. And finally looking at the context and her life around her marriage before she really becomes very overtly politically active. So if you remember, she leaves Russia in the early 1890s to go and study economics, and she leaves in the process her husband and son. So I usually generally see that as a bit of a demarcation point in her life where she begins to really become more overtly active. So maybe think about bringing her family background and early life up to around that period. So what you'd be thinking of doing is then trying to actually think about a range of examples and events and people that fit into this that you can describe those early years with. Her relationship to her father's relationship to her mother, how many sisters she had, what life was like in that family, her governesses, etc. That would help you also think about how she was educated by Maria Strakova. She taught her lots of classical works of Western literature, John Stuart Mill, the philosophers, liberal philosophers, but also Russian literature, Tolstoy, and so on. So she was educated in some ways in an informal sense with her governess, but also that allowed her to go on to do more formal education. So she got a teaching certificate at 16 and then was able to do some evening courses and so on, and later obviously getting into the university in Switzerland under Heinrich Harkener. So there's some themes you could discuss around that, some examples that you can bring up to flesh that out a little. And then also, if you're discussing her marriage, you might discuss the circumstances under which she was married. Family wanted her to marry essentially up in terms of class, and she wanted to marry for love, partially as a kind of act of rebellion, I think, that she was asserting her own sense of independence and freedom. But she also thought with her marriage that it was a way of in a sense, finding union with other people or another person. She expected married life to be probably more free than it was, and also probably more, it would give her more time than she actually eventually had. So she thought she would sort of be a mother and a wife, but also a writer and a thinker, and they tended not to they tended not to be necessarily mutually exclusive, but they certainly demanded, both of those things demanded quite a lot from her time, and she found, I think, that she couldn't really be both. She wanted to write more and she wanted to be more political, but her marriage really prevented her from doing that. Was part of the frustration and probably part of the reason she left Vladimir in the 1890s. So that would give you a pretty good sweep of that topic, those topics I should say, and if you were able to come up with the details that I was just sort of, the examples I was just giving here, then that would give your response quite a lot of depth. So that's just one little trick to maybe thinking about Part A. Remember, it's only 10 marks, so don't go too far, and certainly keep an eye on the time. That's the big thing, that you don't go over the time that you're kind of allocated. So 17, 18 minutes, definitely not over 20 minutes, or you start to eat into the second question. Now, if you're preparing this for this with your revision, and go to the syllabus document, it's on page 50 of the syllabus. And the points that you need to be prepared to write about are these four here. Remember, you need to be able to discuss her historical context. You need to be able to discuss her background, so family background and political activity. You need to discuss her rise to prominence, her role in the 1917 revolution, and her role as Commissar for Social Welfare. And then later on in Part B, you'd have to be able to analyse her significance. So if you think about Part A, really what you need to be prepared to do is describe, narrate, outline, recount something about one or a collection of these. You could be asked about her background and historical context. You could be asked about her rise to prominence, in which case you wouldn't necessarily need to go into detail about her historical context, but you might need to bring in some of this, that she, in a sense, if you're discussing her rise to prominence, you might suggest that she turned away from some of the ideals of her family, not all of them, but some of them. They wanted generally for her to be educated, but also to live a fairly comfortable life, not necessarily become a full-time revolutionary. So you might discuss this in terms of the development of her political activity and how that fed into her role in the Bolshevik Party and therefore her role in the 1917 revolution. And then again, how that led into her role in terms of the Commissar for Social Welfare. Remember here, part of the material you might be able to bring up here is, in terms of social welfare, is the fact that she resigned from that position after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March 1918. She was an out-and-out internationalist and thought that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had basically contravened the Bolsheviks' promise to create a worldwide revolution, or at least make that their priority. So that's another thing that you could bring up. I don't think you would want to go far beyond that, because the syllabus is the syllabus, and if you're asked to write about, say, the rise to prominence, I don't think you'd want to go beyond that. Some people often think of her rise to prominence as also perhaps including her role in the Jeannette Dell. So I think if you were going to write about that, don't necessarily write about a lot, because it's listed here under the significance and evaluation. But a lot of people see that, in a sense, this was another one of her main public roles that really brought her out into the open in terms of her prominent work. But I would tend to avoid it just because it's listed here. And if the marker is really being strict in terms of the syllabus, then you might get, I don't think you'd get punished necessarily, but it might limit the marks you can get. So make sure that you're familiar with, the important takeaway point with this is make sure you're familiar with what is included under each of these three things for Part A: historical context, background, and rise to prominence, so that if you're asked about one of them, you know exactly what you can and can't write about. And also if you're asked to pair a couple up and discuss them, then you're able to write about them in breadth as well.